Everyone, it's so good to have Ben today on the channel, Dr. Benjamin Keep, an expert in learning. I've just invited him on to talk to us a bit about language learning, his own experience, and also his role of delving into the research and finding out a bit more about what are the best ways to kind of approach this topic. So just before we get started, would it be okay if you do a brief introduction? That'd be all right.
Sure, of course. So I am a person. I have a PhD in learning sciences and technology design, and before that I was an attorney for a few years before I decided to change careers. What I've been engaged in more recently is kind of starting a YouTube channel. I work a lot with companies to design learning experiences or design training experiences to make these more effective, or design research that tries to understand the learning processes that are going on and improve them. Recently, I've started a YouTube channel a couple of years ago, and I occasionally post videos on it. I haven't been very consistent lately. What I'm really interested in is taking the research on learning and and not just explaining, but helping people to use that research in their lives more effectively, because a lot of times this research kind of gets bottled up inside the research communities, and it doesn't really spread out to teachers and students and the people that could probably use it. At the same time, I'm interested in kind of contextualizing the research and kind of matching that to experience as well, because a lot of times research isn't relevant to certain people or isn't relevant to certain kind of situations, or there's lots that we learn just through learning experiences as well. And so to kind of blend both of these sources of knowledge together so that we can improve how we learn.
No, thank you so much for that, Ben. Yeah, I've invited Dr. Keep onto the channel because I came across this YouTube channel a while back, and it's been so useful for me into learning medicine. I was also really interested in your opinion on language learning, like how you've gone about researching that area, because it comes across as very controversial, perhaps more so than like the meta learning field. So yeah, it's great to have you on the channel to be able to talk about some of these topics today and to share your experiences and your expertise in this field. So no, it's great.
I should say, by the way, that I am not a language learning specialist in terms of doing active research, peer-reviewed research on language learning. I focus more on problem solving in math and science, science mostly. But after Will asked me to be on the. I was already planning on digging deep into the research and reading. I mean, part of what I do is to read pretty deeply in a given research area and try to figure out what's going on there. And so I'm still kind of in the middle, I would say, of doing research on this area, but enough to, I feel like, have reached some reasonable conclusions, I hope. And I'm sure we'll talk about certain maybe research findings at some point, or certain examples. But anyhow, just wanted to clarify that in case anyone was like, hey, you don't do any research on language learning, and it's true, I don't.
No, there's always that odd person that will, like, if we don't say kind of disclaimer, they'll be like, oh, well, where's your PhD in linguistics? Like,
right, exactly. I don't have a PhD in linguistics, exactly.
No, but I think with your background, it's definitely not a lot more than myself about this field. So it's so good to have your input on this, really. So just to start us off, I think a really interesting topic that's come up in the research over quite a long period of time, actually, is like comprehensible input. So would you be able to kind of introduce us to this idea, and we'll kind of go from there and talk about how we can use this in language
I think if anyone's watching this video, they've probably heard of comprehensible input, I would assume, or if you're on a language learning journey, you hear this a lot. But the idea is that you've got two words here. You've got input. Input means listening or reading, as opposed to speaking or writing. And comprehensible means that you're able to understand the meaning of what is said to you, or what you're reading. The idea is that using comprehensible input, or kind of getting lots of quote unquote comprehensible input, is either very, very important or maybe all that matters in terms of language learning. This was an idea that was originally kind of formulated and pushed by a guy named Stephen Krashen, who actually is a language learning researcher. It was, I think it was in the early 1980s, maybe 83, 4, 5, that he first started writing about this in the context of kind of a larger theory about how language learning works. And the idea is that you should be, say, if you're reading something, you should be reading something that's a little bit beyond your current level, and that competency in language in terms of the ability to do all the things, speak, listen, read, whatever, comes mostly from copious amounts of comprehensible input. That doesn't solve the problem of how to get it, whether there are some forms that are better or worse than others, this kind of thing. So, and certainly this is within the broader language learning community or research community. This is basically one person's idea about how things work, and it has a fair amount of support, but there are lots of other researchers with other ideas.
So I remember you saying that, like, it kind of needs to be a bit beyond what your current level is. So what would that look like for the average language learner, would you say?
For me, the kind of one of the stereotypical use cases is you know enough language to read, say, very simple things, or to listen to a very slowly spoken dialogue using basic vocabulary. And so, you would start kind of at the most basic level that you could, and then as you advanced, you would get more and more more and more complicated, realistic forms of the language that you're trying to learn. And so there's a couple of graded readers, which have been popular for quite a while, kind of follow this idea a little bit.
Definitely.
Because a lot of times the idea is that you might start off with a very basic kind of book, and then once you've read a couple of basic books on different topics, and all along that you're kind of gaining vocabulary and maybe learning some more grammatical structures, and then you do the next level and the next level and the next level. And the idea is to focus more on understanding the meaning of the content rather than any kind of explicit grammatical instruction, or you're not learning specific grammatical structures, and you're not spending a lot of time learning specific vocabulary words. The advantage is that you're seeing a lot of these things in the natural context that it makes sense in. So it's just that those contexts get kind of more and more complex and realistic over time. I mean, graded readers are one example. LingQ, I think, or Link. That's another source of comprehensible input, right? You can listen to podcasts or various other kinds of content that people upload. You can read those same things, and so. But the idea of the kind of advanced, one level advanced from where you are, is a pretty hazy idea. I mean, no one's really able to define what exactly that step is, but everyone agrees that you want to be continually challenging yourself and moving forward.
Definitely. I mean, it does make sense, doesn't it? It's like when you're learning anything else, really, you want to be learning slightly more, building your base of knowledge, working slightly further up. So although it seems quite hazy in the fact that no one can clearly define what, for example, I+1 actually means, what percentage of unknown words or unknown grammatical structures, what that actually looks like. I think it's very clear that that is obviously needed, and it is logical that you need to be kind of approaching and kind of getting input slightly higher than your current level. I do think it does make sense. I
mean, there is one, I remember reading somewhere, and I'd have to look back to see exactly where I read, if you're targeting, if you understand about like 90%, around like 90% of what you've read or heard, that's probably a good spot to be in. When you start only remember, and maybe even 80% is okay, somewhere in that range. But then when you start to drop much lower than that, then I think that's when it ceases to be that effective. And then obviously, if you understand everything completely perfectly and super fluently, and you don't have to think really at all about understanding it, well, that's something that's too easy for you.
Yeah. I mean, this is obviously coming more from a personal experience than extensive research, etc. However, I personally want to. My Mandarin learning journey, I've always stuck around like 80-90% because any lesson I'm understanding less than, like you're understanding 4 and 5 words or less, aren't you? So at that point, it becomes very, very hard to work things out from context because you're missing so much. It becomes a lot less enjoyable as well. So I think that's a really good recommended range to kind of put everyone in, I would say. At that point, no one can really go too wrong, can they? This is a really big, meaty question next. Is comprehensible input all that we need in language learning? And where does this idea kind of stand in the research, would you say?
So it's certainly not all you need in terms of if you want to reach high levels of mastery in a language. And the evidence comes from a couple of different sources. So I don't know, not famously, I guess famously in the research world, there's been a lot of research on French immersion programs in Canada.
I've read this research too, yeah.
So what they did something like Stephen Krashen would recommend, at least it seems like in principle, where you put these kids relatively early on into these immersion programs where they use a tremendous amount of, or they kind of get a tremendous amount of comprehensible input, and they're kind of slowly leveled up, in a way really that you can only get in a classroom context because someone has designed all the levels to kind of move them forward, and they take in a lot. But what you found, or what the researchers tended to find, is that even years later, they've been in these programs for years, that they would still make fundamental kind of speaking mistakes and production errors. And part of this, so there's a couple of different reasons, or people proposed a couple of different reasons for this. One is that comprehensible input is good at telling you what you can do, but it's not very good at telling you what you can't do, because it doesn't present you with quote unquote like negative examples. It only presents you with positive examples. You're only reading grammatically correct or roughly correct language. And so when you go to produce your own language, what happens is that you might, when we go to speak, we're pulling together different things that we read to try to, express the meaning that we want to express. And sometimes we put those together incorrectly, but we don't necessarily know that they're incorrect. And this is also influenced a little bit by, what language you're coming from. There's just that problem of kind of getting the right kind of feedback and the negative examples. But then there's also this what also can happen is that when you in the classrooms, they were finding that students would kind of reach a certain level in terms of speaking, like they'd speak well enough to be understood by the teachers in the contexts that were in those classrooms. But because they're not using French kind of in everyday life necessarily, and they're not being forced to we'll talk later about like what's called pushed output, like being forced to kind of make more and more complex and grammatically correct sentences. And I hate using the word grammatically correct. I mean, like language, like native speaker understood, properly done. And you can be grammatically correct and still be wrong. Like it can still be the wrong thing to say, or inappropriate. But what happens is people plateau, and they kind of, I mean, this is true of anything. You avoid hard things, and so students tend to avoid constructions that they don't understand very well, and so they'll stay in the safe space where they have these simplified constructions. They can say yes or no. They can ask a question in a particular format, and they're not really challenging themselves to do that. So that was kind of some of the explanations for why in this particular setting that comprehensible input didn't seem to work that well. And I mean, another argument is just from kind of basic learning principles here of if you're not speaking a lot, if you're not interacting with like that's what language is interacting with other people and negotiating the meaning that we have. Even I mean, we are both fluent English speakers. We could be talking to each other and we could be misunderstanding each other, and then we have the tools to figure out, hopefully, if we're doing okay, like to figure out what our misunderstanding is and how to clarify that misunderstanding. And so there's some of this that is socio-cultural. There's some of this that is just about fluency, about like, if you don't try speaking that much, then you don't
get good at speaking.
You just don't get good at speaking. Like it's just, and so that's why a number of other researchers. I'm not quite sure why comprehensible input has, by itself, become very, very popular now. Like this idea was created in the 1980s, and
it's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago, and it has changed. Like it had an influence on how foreign language teachers taught languages. And language teaching is different today. I don't know if, I think Stephen Krashen still thinks it's hasn't changed maybe enough, but I sometimes wonder, like I don't know if people know how bad language teaching really was in the old days, like just strict memorization of structures and vocabulary words. And so, but other researchers have kind of tried to illustrate the different ways that other kinds of situations help, not just comprehensible input, but other situations help language competency. So I think comprehensible input is just critically important. Like and I think people they underestimate the amount of not just comprehensible input, but overall exposure and use of the language that they actually need to become good at it. So it's like you can't really go wrong emphasizing comprehensible input, but I don't think that you shouldn't stop and just be like, oh, this is the key to everything, and then I don't need anything else. No, definitely. I think one of the points that I thought was really good that you've made there is about the kind of the social side of things as well. Like you've got to learn to interact in the language, and from those interactions we also learn a lot. You get a lot of comprehensive input, you also get a lot of corrective feedback, and things like these we kind of need to learn faster. I think one of the other things that's mentioned in comprehensive input is like kind of downplays the role of feedback a bit, but I personally found feedback to be very, very useful in the like things that I got wrong I could correct very, very quickly, because I'd go away and be like, right, I said that wrong, like let's sort out my pronunciation, let's sort out my structure there, this is a better way of saying it, let me learn this better way of saying it. So that's one of the problems I have with it, in that if you're just reading and listening, you're not getting that side of things, you're not getting that interaction, you're not getting that corrective feedback, that feedback like loop. You're trying things out, getting it wrong, getting corrected so you can say it right next time. Like I think that's kind of missing from comprehensible input if you're just relying on that alone. However, I totally agree. Like I would listen to I still do now. I just listen to so much Chinese and like read so much in Chinese, because like it really helps a lot. It's getting, like you said, it's getting exposure to lots of different constructs, lots of different vocab in different contexts, and it's enjoyable to do as well, which is great. But on the other hand, I do think overemphasizing it can lead to, like you said, this
this kind of avoidance of things that are hard. And from like a, as you know, way better than myself, I don't feel I have that kind of I don't think I'm allowed to say this, but like from a meta learning perspective, it's like that lack of kind of doing things that are hard and that require effort. Like you're working very passively with comprehensible input. However, if you're involving some output and some corrective feedback, like you're activating kind of what you know and trying to use it, which is something that people don't really get good at by just getting more passive exposure. It's kind of, I'd say from like a meta learning perspective, like you kind of need that effort in order to increase your ability to kind of retain what you're learning. I don't know, would you believe am I correct in saying that?
I am 100% in agreement. Yeah. I mean, I think, and this is, maybe it goes back to the introduction a little bit. Like, I think in any domain, research has interesting things to say, but I think experience also has interesting things to say too. And so a lot of times, I think connecting these two. And so it's like, I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to speak from their experience and like, hey, I don't know, this is the way. Yeah, it's not an empirical study, but it's the way that I feel from learning and observing what I'm doing. Yeah. I have two things to say. One is that this is not in the language learning realm whatsoever, but there's this fascinating paper on asking students to evaluate different study methods.
And I've read this paper.
And you have these students, and they're trying to figure out like what's the underlying kind of cause that makes students favor one method over another. And a lot of it comes down to effort. Students tend to favor low effort methods over high effort methods, which, like, obviously you can exert a lot of effort incorrectly in the wrong direction and not learn. But in general, a lot of the methods that, like I talk about on my channel, like interleaving, spacing, contextual variation, testing, these kinds of things, these are hard. They're harder than the alternatives usually. And so usually it's the harder method or the where you exert more effort that you should be favoring, but people kind of tend to favor the exact opposite. And even though this had nothing to do with the language learning context, I think that in language learning there's even more of this going on almost because there's the anxiety of using the language, looking stupid. There's and so I feel like there's even more pressure to just be like, I'm just going to stay here. I'm good. I can order my coffee. Let's just sit down, and do nothing. And I feel it within myself too, as I'm learning, where it's just like, there are times when I'm just like, I'm not pushing myself enough. The other thing that your comments kind of brought to mind is this idea of, they call it comprehensible input, and I mean that's a reasonable term, but there's also the idea of like comprehended input. If you are listening to a podcast but not paying much attention to it, it's not going to help you. And I think this comes down to like, and again, seeing things from the outside. This is just my opinion from watching various YouTube videos or seeing other language learners do their things. And I just think that sometimes people trick themselves into thinking like, oh, like I'm watching this movie in this language, and and it's really helping me. And it's like, I don't know if you're even paying attention to the language actually. Like I don't know, like you have to actually be processing the language for it to work. In a way, it can't just be like, well, I'm kind of just listening to this podcast while I'm driving, or while I'm doing something else, and I'm not really paying that much attention. So, and it comes down to actually choosing the right level of content, which is hard to find if you're learning on your own. It's extremely hard to find the right level of content, and it's changing all the time. And so it's very easy to kind of be like, oh, I'm not really thinking about it. I'm just kind of at this level again. And it's like, oh, wait, this has been really be easy for weeks. Maybe I should make it harder. And yeah, it's easy to think like this is something that's really being helpful. And I think it also comes back to like what you were saying earlier, where around like the 80-90% understanding has been good for you, because if you go too far below that, then you just don't. It just washes over you again. It's almost like listening to